In today's episode, I will show you how to build an MVC framework from scratch using PHP. This tutorial utilizes object-oriented programming principles within PHP, so if you aren't so comfortable with those yet, feel free to check out my object-oriented programming video on my channel that I posted previously. But before we get into the video, I'd really appreciate if you could like and subscribe so this video can get boosted to other developers just like yourself, and it would mean a lot to me. Anyways, without further ado, let's get into the video. Before we get to the coding part, I wanted to quickly go over what an MVC framework is and why it is useful. I've just done a little rough sketch here demonstrating what it is. But the MVC, which stands for Model View Controller, is a three-step architecture model consisting of a view, a model, and a controller. It's quite an easy pattern to understand. As a user, the user interacts with the view. The view displays the HTML, shows them the data is the visual interface that the user interacts with. This means any updates or any data that they might enter into the view will get sent from our view to our controller. Our controller manages that data, processes it, does whatever it needs to. Then after packaging that data, it sends it off to a model. The model is the business logic. It controls the connection with the data store, like a database. The model is responsible for storing that data, which then in turn will update what actually is shown on the view. As you can see, it is quite a circular pattern, or triangular, however you want to think about it. It's quite an easy architecture model, and it can really elevate your applications. A lot of top quality frameworks utilize the MVC structure, such as .NET with Blazor, Laravel, which uses PHP, and something like Ruby on Rails. With this architecture type, you're able to control each key component of how data travels through your application. So then, without further ado, let's just get to actually creating one of our own. Alright then, so let's get started. So first things first, I'll open up Xampp, as I'll be using Xampp to host my Apache server and also my MySQL server, as we'll be needing both for this project. After we've got that running, we can get to creating the actual app. I've already opened up a folder inside of VS Code, as you can see here, a completely blank folder, which you can do so as well. So let's start off by creating the entry point to our app, which will be this index.php file. Any code will run through this index file. Now this index file, we're actually not going to touch just yet. First, I'm going to create a new folder called Bootstrap. And inside of this Bootstrap folder, I will include a bootstrap.php file. This PHP file will contain the initial code that gets started up on our application. The first thing I will do is I will declare strict types to 1. What this means is that our application ensures that we declare strict types. This enhances safety and ensures type safety throughout the application. Therefore, if types don't match, we will actually get a error more than just a simple bah. After this, I will define some global variables. The first one I will define is our base path. Base path is going to be the dir name, so the directory name of dir. This will give a base path of our application, and we'll define it as a global constant base path within that application. Another one I like to define is also my app path. Here is where our app will live, or the backend, as I like to call, of the MVC structure. This will include base path followed by the app string. This means anything within our this means the next thing I'll define is a views path, which similarly will be the folder of views. And finally, the last one, which will be the core path. The core path will be the core folder. So within our app directory in the app, we will host our backend logic. This will consist of having our models and our controllers of the application. The views folder will contain the views, the user interface that the user interacts with. And the core folder will be the structure and the templates for our MVC project. Of course, further on in this tutorial, we will go over in more depth each one of these folders, but this is the main structure of our framework. Next, I'll start a session. This will allow us to store some session data throughout our application, and it's easy to just define it inside of the Bootstrap because we don't have to define a session start within each file. And finally, inside of the Bootstrap file, I like to create an autoloader. An autoloader pretty much automatically includes into our whole application specific files. There are obviously packages that do this for us in a better way, such as Composer. But here we'll just use our own one, as you can also do that yourself. So we'll start by creating an SPL autoload register, which takes in a callback function. So we'll create this. That takes a string class. Here I'll define a simple array with roots, which is going to be our app path from our global constant we defined above, followed by / controllers. I'll define another one, which will be for our / models. And finally, we'll have our core path. Within our controllers, here, as you could probably infer, is where our controllers live. Similarly, the / models is where our models live. And core is the core functionality of the app. Then for the actual autoloading feature, we'll create a for each loop for each one of the roots as a root. We'll create a file variable, which will be the root, followed by / class from our parameter .php. Finally, we'll check if the file exists, our file, and if it does, we'll require the file, and we'll return. And just like that, we have a simple autoloader that autoloads our controllers, our models, and our core framework functionality. With that, we can now head on over to our index.php file, where we will finally be able to write some code in there. We'll open up our PHP tag, and we'll say require __ the / bootstrap / bootstrap.php to include that bootstrap file we just created. Nice. Now let's head on to the next section. For the next section, we'll actually start working with our core functionalities. We'll create a new folder called core, where inside I'll start by creating a router.php file. Here I'll open up our PHP tags and I'll write a class router. This class will store all of our routes for our app and resolve them as the app needs. So I'll create a private array at the top called routes, which will define get and post routes. Of course, we need a way to actually append to this array. We'll use functions for this. I'll create a public function get, which will take a string URI and an array of our action, and it'll return void. Now, why do we get a string URI and an array of action? If you have ever used a framework, for example, something like Laravel, you might have noticed that when you define routes, you add an array, which defines the class, that contains a class path, that contains a class path, as well as a function within that class. Something like this, where you have something like admin controller class, followed by something like sign up. Well, maybe for an admin that'll be a bad example. Login. This is what our array of action will look like. We will also be expecting to get a path of our class, as well as a function name to call. So this is the structure we are expecting. So with this, we'll append to our roots, our get, at our URI, the action. We can do the same thing for our post. So I'll duplicate this function, call it post, and change this to post. Now finally, we need one more function to resolve these roots for us to actually be able to use them. So we'll create a public function resolve, which takes in no parameters and returns void. First, we want to retrieve our URI. We'll pass the URL from our server, request URI, and then we use PHP URL path. Then we also need to get the method. So we'll use the server superglobal again with the request method. Now finally, we'll check if is set this roots at our method at our URI. Then what we can do is we can actually destructure the action array that is stored at the method at our URI. So to do that, we'll do controller and action, which is equal to this roots at our method at our URI. As I mentioned before, the controller will be the path to our controller, for example, our admin controller class, and the action will be something like login. With that, we can now actually create that new controller class and call the action on it. Else, if the root requested doesn't actually exist within our roots array, we want to show a 404 page. A 404 status code pretty much means that something wasn't found. You might have seen this before if you tried to access something online and it just returns with a 404 not found. So to do that, we can use a HTTP response code 404, and maybe you could echo out something like, this root doesn't exist. Or maybe something a bit nicer, maybe something like 404 page not found. Simple and effective. Great. So with that, we have a fully functional router. Now we actually need to initialize it. So within our index.php, we can actually create our router. New router. And as you remember, inside of our Bootstrap file, we actually auto-loaded everything from our core folder, which means that we are actually allowed to do this without requiring the router file. Of course, I do get an underline here. This is due to my PHP plugins within VS Code, as they do expect an import, but I know that is automatically loaded. With that, we're actually able to create roots. So we'll define our roots here. And finally, after defining our roots, we can resolve our router. So inside of our core folder, we'll start working on the controller functionality. Our controller class will actually be an abstract class. What this means is that subclasses that inherit it will gain its functionality, whatever's inside of this controller class. This class itself will not be able to be defined. You can't create a new controller by itself. It needs to be inherited. So with that, let's create some basic functionality, some shared functionality that can be used across different controllers that would be used inside of our application. The first function would most likely be a display function to be able to actually display a view. So public function display will take a string page name and an array of data, which was set to empty for now. This function can return void. What do our parameters mean? Well, the first is our page name. The page name is going to be the name of the view. Actually, a better name might actually be view name. What this will mean is I will look through our views folder and we'll try find the view with this name entered here. After finding it, we will display it to the user. So what is the data? Data is any data that we pass in through our controller. And this will be passed in through a key value array. So how this might look like. Let's say you pass in array here. You pass in something like welcome message and set that to hello there. What we want to do is we want to create a variable called welcome message and store hello there as its values. In PHP, we actually can do this. We can use the extract function, which will take our data as its only parameter. And this will do exactly as I said here. This means if we have multiple, let's say we have another one, such as error, message, this doesn't work. Both of these will be created as variables. We'll have a welcome message variable now inside of our display, as well as an error message with their corresponding values. So the only next thing we really need to do is actually display that view. So you've got that data, now let's display the view. To do that, very simple. Require, we get our views path which we define in the Bootstrap file, and we find that viewName.php. Just like that. So what now this means is that we get the whole view inside of this display function, as well as all the data, which can be therefore passed down into this view. So then inside of our view, we're actually able to access that data. And as you remembered, that, for example, that welcome message we just had, inside of our view, we can actually define it very simply. Let's say we have like a h1 tag. We can very simply just go PHP echo and then our welcome message, as this will be passed down. You'll see this later on when we create some example views. But for now, this is how we would display a view. I'd like to create another function. This function will be for receiving inputs, as that is probably one of the key things of having an application. A user can enter inputs, which get processed for something to happen. So create a public function, I'll call it input, where we get a string name, and a default, which I'll set to null. And this will return a mixed result. So let me explain the parameters here. When we call this function, we want to try receive an input from a GET or a POST request that's been sent with the specific name specified. If that value doesn't exist, we'll return with the default, which here will be null. Null is quite a good standard, but as I specified a default inside of the parameter case, this means a user of our framework can actually define their own default case, which is very convenient. Anyways, this function is a very simple helper function where we can do return get at our name. If that's null, we'll return post with our name. If that's also null, we'll return our default. This therefore checks our get requests first and our post requests. Of course, you can be a bit more specific. You can have each function for a post or a get, because here, as I said, we check a get condition first before a post. This is just a simple way of doing it. Again, feel free to experiment, make up more functions, make them more specific. Nothing wrong with that. And a final function that I like to create is a redirect function, which will just have a string location, which will return void. And all this will do is we'll set the header location to our location. I used the wrong string here. There you go. And finally, exit to exit the script. And just like that, we have a basic base controller class with 3 functions: to display a view, receive inputs, and to redirect. Of course, feel free to add as much as you'd like. We're just creating a simple MVC framework here, where I think that these 3 functions are key. So then, let's actually get to creating our own custom controllers and trying out our MVC framework. So then, I'll create a new folder called app, and inside of this app folder, I'll create a folder for controllers. This is following the definition that we define inside of our Bootstrap, where we have an app path, and then inside of our root, we check for our controllers for auto loading. So this is where a user that might use this MVC framework will input their own custom controllers. Of course, we'll also have models, which, as you've probably noticed, we have not defined yet inside of our core. First, I just want to test that everything works with just a controller and a view. Afterwards, we'll get to implementing models. So I'll create a new file, something simple. Let's do home controller.php. Inside of here, I'll create a PHP tag, where inside I'll create a class called home controller, which extends our controller from our core. As you can see, I do not explicitly require it because we auto-loaded the controller. I'll create a basic function, public function index, which returns void, where inside I'll just use the display function that we define inside of our controller base class, followed by home, and leaving the second parameter empty, as I don't want to pass in any data. With that, that is a basic controller defined. Now I'll create a new folder inside of our root called views, where inside I will have a home.php. Home, because we're looking for a home view here. So inside of our home, I will define some basic HTML. I will define a h1, hello to my app, with maybe a h2, this is all MVC. And you know what? Just to show off the data feature, let's actually add some data. I'll add a welcome message, followed by welcome user. So now, inside of our view, I'm actually able to access that. I'll create a h2 here. I'll say welcome message, followed by PHP echo $ welcome message. And we should hopefully see our welcome message come through. As you can see, this is undefined here, as it says, because we don't explicitly define this here. But we know that it has been defined because of the way we've set up our controller. This is just a PHP IntelliSense for VS Code being a little bit annoying. Anyways, let's see how that looks on the browser. So we'll go to localhost /MVC YT. And I get a 404 not found. This is because I forgot to actually include this root inside of our index.php. So router get / for our /URL, our home URL, and our action will be an array of our home controller class followed by that index function. We're actually able to click through this. Perfect. Now let's reload and see what happens. Again, we get 404 page not found. Well, let's head on over back to our router. Something must be wrong with our URI parsing. And this is bound to happen. The reason I didn't include it earlier is because I wanted to show you this first. As an error message like this doesn't really give us, that's not even an error message. It just tells you 404 not found. Even though we did define a root. How come? Well, if I var dump this roots right here, you can see that the root actually does exist correctly. But now what if I var dump our URI? MVC YT /. When using something like examp, where you have custom folders first, like I have here, localhost / MVC YT, your base path starts here. But because we're inside of this folder, it appends it to our root. So here we're actually getting MVCYT, not our forward slash. With that, it's actually quite a simple fix. We'll check if stir contains, inside of our URI, our / MVCYT. Of course, if your folder is called something else, make sure you define it here as the right thing. If that's true, we'll set the URI to a substring URI strlen of our MVC-YT. And finally, we'll have one of these. URI is equal to URI. If it's null, it would just be a forward slash. Perfect. Now let's see how that looks. There you go. We have correctly gone to our home page, our home root. And as you can see, our welcome message shows. If I go back to my home controller and change to welcome user, we are pleased to see you. This will update here, just like that. Perfect. This means we have our controller and routing set up perfectly. As you have noticed, because we're using custom routing, we don't have that .php file extension for our files. Now, let's try out a file that doesn't exist yet, like something like about us. As you can see, we get a URL not found. Now, why is this, you might ask? This is because we still use Apache, as you can see here. We still haven't set up our router perfectly just yet. Because we're using examp, we need to override the Apache router. To do so, you use a special htaccess file. Now I have this code here saved on my nice little notepad because it's quite a complex code. There you go. I'll make sure to put this code down into the description as well. Or you could just simply ChatGPT it and ChatGPT will give it to you straight away. But pretty much we're setting the rewrite engine on and for it to use our custom routes through our index.php file. With this, I go back to our 404 here. We actually get our custom 404 page, not found message. Perfect. I think the next thing we need to do is to create the models. So similarly to what we did with controller, I'll head on over to our core folder and I'll create a new file called model.php. Inside of here, I'll create the PHP tags and create another abstract class for our model. Again, this means that this class cannot be created by itself. It needs to be inherited. For our connection to our database, which is what will live inside of our model, we'll use a PDO connection. So first, I'd like to define our variables for our connection. So first, I'll start with host, which is equal to localhost. Another variable for our database name, which will be, we'll do MVC-YT test. Private string, we'll do the username for our database, which will be root. We'll create another variable for our password, which will be empty. I'll create a protected PDO for our database, which will store our database connection. So then, I'll create a private function called connect, which will call the connect logic. Of course, it will return void. If you watched any of the previous videos, so far, this might look quite similar. So then, I'll create a try block, where inside, I'll set this DB equal to a new PDO connection. I'll set the MySQL, as I'll be using MySQL. The host will be equal to this host, and the DB name will be set to this DB name. The username will be this username, and the password will be this password. Finally, we'll have this DB set attribute PDO attr error mode PDO error mode exception. And finally, we can catch those PDO exceptions. So catch PDO exception as the echo database error, followed by message, and finally exit the script. That's how we would create a basic PDO connection to our application, and we'll store that reference to our database variable here, which will be used by subclasses to actually call to the database. Finally, I like to do this, hence why I created the connect function as private, but I'll create a constructor. It's a private public function constructor, where we'll set, we won't set anything, we'll just call this connect, which will just call this connect function. So anytime any model gets created, it will automatically connect to the database, which will then guarantee us that database connection. Perfect, that's pretty much everything we really need for the model class. Within the model class, if you would like to expand, I do like creating some helper functions like we did with the controller. For example, something like a function that returns data from a table, or a specific getBy function. For demonstration purposes, I will actually show you how to do this. I like to define a protected string TBL name, which will be overridden in subclasses of the model class, which means we're actually able to create these functions that will call the right database table. Let's quickly minimize these, but I'll quickly create an example for a function that returns all data. So public function all, which will return an array. We'll create our statement, which will be equal to this db prepare, and our SQL will be select star from, we can do this here, this TBL name. Then we'll do statement execute. We don't really need to pass any parameters, and we'll return statement fetch all. Now fetch all here returns an empty array or an array of the data, hence why we're returning array, not bool or anything like that. So with this function, any subclass of the model class will actually be able to access this all function and call it. So then, let's put that to the test. As we defined inside of our Bootstrap, our models live within our app. So I'll create a new folder here called models, where inside I'll create a basic model. Let's do something like a user model.php. Again, I'll create PHP tags and a class user model, which extends our model abstract class. Now, as I've defined a TBL name property that I can override, if I want to access the all functionality properly, I need to actually define, I should have explained this. Now then, if I want to access and utilize that all function properly from our model, I need to override the protected table name property that lives inside a model. To do this, we just copy its definition. Protected string TBL name even comes up here. And I'll set the TBL name to something like users. With that, I can actually leave my users model, as I don't really need to touch it anymore. If I want to get all the data from my users table, that functionality exists inside of our model class. So then, let's actually use our model. I'll go inside of my home controller and I'll display I'll get all the users and display them on the home page. To do so, I'll create a result variable, or maybe users variable, which will be a new user model all. And as you can see, we're allowed to call this. With that, we get an array of all of our users. So then, I'm going to get rid of this here, and I'll create a users variable, which will store our users. Now then, let's see what happens when we run this. Oh, that's the wrong URL. And we get a database error. This is because we actually haven't defined the database yet. Make sure that our example is running. We can click on admin to take us to PHP MyAdmin, where we can actually create this database so we can actually use it. as well as we can also create the users table while we're there. So I'll create a new, this will be MVC YT test. Inside of here, I'll create a new table named users. And we'll do something basic like an ID, auto increment, maybe a email, varchar 255, a username, a password, varchar 255, and a created timestamp, which will be, where is it? The date and time, and where's the default? Default will be current timestamp. Save. Very basic users table. Now, let's see what happens if you run this again. We still get an issue. Get added info for localhost DB and MVC failed. Not such host is known. Interesting. Let's have a look. Localhost. MySQL host. I believe this is because we need one of these here. Ta-da! I was right. Yeah, I put a comma here, not a semicolon. That is my fault. You need to put a semicolon here. Anyways, as you can see, now we get another warning. Warning undefined variable welcome message. That's because we got rid of it. So we'll go here. We can now remove this and actually display our users. And the cool thing is we can actually loop over our users, as we'll return our users as a PDO array. We can loop over each individual element to display each individual user. So I'll create a table. Let's do something like row heading will be index and maybe data, user data. Or should we just do user email? Let's just do user email. And then finally here, we can open up our PHP tags and we can do a for each. User, I believe that's what I called it. Let's have a look. Oh, it's users. As I'll do index and user to get the actual index as well. And while we loop over that, I'll create a row with the index being the index and the data, the email being the user email. And finally, PHP end for each. Of course, we get a squiggly here because there is an undefined variable, but we know that it is defined through our controller. So then, let's see how that looks. Reload. We get our basic table. Of course, nothing is displayed. Let's just quickly add a border to this table so we can see it a bit better. Just like that. Now then, let's actually create some data. So I will, where is it? Insert. For email, we'll just do test@email.com and a password of 123. See if that worked. Yep. Let's insert another one, which will be Mike@email.com. Password of 321. Now we've got two accounts inside of our database. If I reload, both of them show up here with our index. Of course, it's 0 indexed, so let's maybe do index +1. That's a little bit nicer. Or if we really wanted to, we can actually get the user ID. We can eliminate the index, so we don't really need it, and instead we can do user ID. That's a bit better. And just like that, we can get our users through our view, through our model, through our controller. And with that, that wraps up our MVC framework. This is a very basic, simple MVC framework, but hopefully through this tutorial, you were able to understand how an MVC framework functions, even if it's just bare bones. Of course, most MVC frameworks have way more functionality. But of course, with what you've got now, from what I've just shown you, you can expand the functionality and create the functions you like. You can create more functions out of a model. You can create more functions out of the controller. You can create more files inside of the core. But what I've just shown you is the bare minimum. But it's enough to get you decent results. So then, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you were able to learn something. If you were, please leave a like and subscribe, as it will mean loads to me. And if you want to see more videos like this, please comment. If you'd like to see an extension to this, maybe some more functionalities, maybe creating a full application with this exact framework we've just created today, then leave a like and comment below if that's what you want. Anyways, with that, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and I'll see you in the next one.